This episode of the Modern Therapist Survival Guide is brought to you by Turning Point.
Turning Point Financial Life Planning helps therapists confidently navigate every aspect of their financial life, from practice financials and personal budgeting to investing, tax management, and student loans. Visit turningpointhq.com to learn more and enter the promo code Modern Therapist for 30% off their Quick Start coaching package.
Listen at the end of the episode for more information.
You're listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide, where therapists live, breathe, and practice as human beings. To support you as a whole person and a therapist, here are your hosts, Curt Widhalm and Katie Vernoy.
Welcome back, Modern Therapists. This is the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. I'm Curt Widhalm with Katie Vernoy, and this is the podcast for therapists that looks at uncomfortable things in our profession. And this is another one of those episodes that does that. And we are talking about the already developed but looming and worsening mental health workforce shortage across America. And this actually, some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today also has impact worldwide. So for our international listeners as well, we're going to talk about you too. But there's been this little thing called the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes.
And those of us in the know before the pandemic knew that mental health access was not great in pretty much all parts of the world. And we follow along workforce issues and work with our legislature and the U.S. government on some access issues in our advocacy efforts, and continue to have an interest and continue to provide advocacy on this. And as we're looking at the next few years, it's going to get worse. That we are seeing an exodus of workers from the mental health workforce. We are seeing a lot of reports from research organizations. We're going to talk about some things out of a research group called Mercer and their reports that things are looking bad in the next 5 years as far as mental health workers, that there is a exodus of workers here. Katie and I have talked before about how hard it is to become even eligible for some of these positions, and it's going to get a whole lot worse.
Paired with what people were colloquially calling a mental health pandemic. You know, the second wave of pandemic is a mental health pandemic. And I think for me, I'm actually seeing this in my own practice. I opened for new clients and I'm getting calls from folks who can't find someone who takes their insurance, who are not getting calls back. I mean, there are already issues with folks being able to access mental health treatment when they want it. And we've also got this worker exodus. And I think the broad strokes of this, I think, are that there are, at least locally, you know, for me, I don't know that many people that take insurance. You know, many people have gotten off insurance panels. I'm getting off insurance panels because of the what they pay. And I think it's something where people want to use their insurance. People also at times need higher levels of care, and those beds are not there. I was reading an article out of Colorado where there are folks who are staying in, I think, solitary confinement because they can't get into mental health facilities when they've been determined that that's the appropriate type of incarceration. Not that that's kind of what we're talking about today, but there are so few mental health workers across the breadth and depth of our field that people are not getting the services that they need, and there are big impacts on our community. So this is already happening, but it's something where we are also leaving the profession, and that's pretty terrifying.
And we've been talking about this for a while. We had a episode earlier this year on why therapists quit. We had several follow-up episodes to it but in looking at the trends, and I'm looking at the Mercer report here, we are looking at some major mental health shortage of workers. The Mercer report talks about that they're expecting 400,000 mental health workers will leave the occupation entirely over the next 5 years. And that's going to be leaving mostly public mental health employers with a shortage of 510,000 spots US nationwide. Getting into the reasons why, we've covered in a number of other episodes. Super high caseloads.
Yep.
Large caseloads, the very quick return to business as normal in a lot of situations. And this is echoed really largely at the time of this recording. I'm seeing early reports of this is really impacting places like college counseling centers that are a month into the new year, two months into the new academic year by the time that this episode drops, and are seeing increases from last year's already increased rates of seeking services by over 20% year over year. So they are facing increased calls for services with a drop in available workers to come in and provide services. The experience of these workers is also that the crises that are coming in are bigger and more severe than they have been in the past. So we're getting this perfect storm of more need, higher need, and fewer people to do it. And most people in our profession, as caregivers, tends to want to help out, but it does lead to just this really systemic burnout problem that is easier for a lot of people to go and not work in this profession because it is just so taxing at this point.
Yeah, I think it's something where when I've had in the past short staffing, whether I was a mental health provider or a supervisor or manager, what we by and large do is take more cases, do more work, just try to keep going. Everybody needs us. We can't say no. It's really hard. It's all of those things. I was picturing Adriana, when she came and talked on our episode around the same thing happening for bilingual clinicians, but just this idea of I can't say no, they need us. And so that just these gigantic caseloads that are both systemically problematic, but also personally problematic because there's just no way to keep that pace up. And so folks burn out and leave really early. But even if they make it through, I mean, we've had this conversation in the burnout machine, and so we won't go too far into this, but it's such a bad situation where not only are the clinicians overworked, burned out, usually not getting paid much more because oftentimes the cuts happen there, and their supervisors and managers have broken away from the day-to-day grind of seeing huge caseloads, but are jaded and not necessarily the support that those clinicians need. And so they might as well have left the profession.
Well, and we specifically talked about this in our gaslighting therapists episode that we did at the beginning of the pandemic. And there's a part of me that really likes having been right, but there's also a part of me that is like, we knew this was coming, and so frustrated just in this was
How do you really feel?
So predictable that this is just calming down.
Well, I think go ahead.
But this is where we haven't changed the way that we take care of the workers. I mean, maybe what we've changed is given them a second Subway sandwich party each month, and
or like cheering, woohoo, way to go, thank you, heroes.
Some sort of banner that promotes you are a hero. But I mean, it's stuff like this, and it's stuff like, okay, we are seeing some of this response in legislation. There's a bill was passed by both houses of the U.S. government. Moving on, we'll link to it in the show notes, but this is a bill written by Senator Tim Kaine to promote and look into interventions for preventing burnout in mental health and healthcare workers. And this is widely celebrated as, all right, we're going to be getting to the problem of why so many people are leaving the profession. How can we address this to keep people in? And these funding bills are continuing to miss the point. In looking at this bill, my first response was, oh, we're going to blame the individual mental health practitioners and the healthcare workers. The bill is literally about promoting mental health care and looking for ways to promote resiliency. And I know that the $30 million that is being spent to investigate this is going to result in do more yoga. And have you thought about therapy? As mental health workers, we know that we need to go to therapy. It's not dealing with all of the access issues. It's not dealing with all of the giant caseload issues. It's not being able to have good workplace practices. It's that Principal Skinner meme of like, is it us the problem? No, it's the workers. They're misinformed. That is just going to continue to reinforce this as a problem. And my big bold prediction is that in a couple of years, they're going to say, well, we spent $30 million on it and it didn't fix anything. So we probably don't need to invest in mental health workforce issues for a while.
Yeah, I think one of I'm going to put this on my to-do list right now, is figuring out if that does go through, is there a way for mental health providers to actually get on task forces and those types of things? Because I think there are possibilities. If there's money going toward it, it has not been decided, Curt. Let me be a little Pollyanna for a second. It has not been decided. It has not been decided. And maybe if our modern therapists across the country go and try to get into these committees and at these tables and talk about what you were just saying, as well as different payment structures, and just drop the RAND report right in front of them and say,
I mean, that's just it, is they're paying for more investigations to end up with things that are already in existence.
Yeah.
We'll have we'll have a call to action about what we can do with that next step, with where that grant money is going with Health and Human Services. Maybe not today. Follow us on our social media, and
we'll figure it out.
We'll figure out exactly who needs to be called on that. Now, some of these other bills that I'm seeing, they do provide for money for hiring more workers. General. Those are good.
Yeah, let's hire more workers. Give them some money. Give them money and autonomy. That's probably not happening, but give them money.
Now, there's other bills to address behavioral healthcare work shortages. This also goes to other healthcare workers. They have their own podcast. We're talking about behavioral healthcare workers here. There are other bills that are addressed towards scholarships for improving access in particularly like rural areas. But with telehealth, I'm seeing a lot of these just in general, like let's get more people into school to be licensed for these positions. And these, in my opinion, are generally misguided and bad bills. And
so scholarships are bad.
Scholarships don't address the problem and actually may end up increasing the problem. Because
why do they increase the problems, my friend? It seems like a lot of people I know, they got these scholarships and it seemed to help them get through.
Scholarship money tends to increase the overall cost of tuition and expenses that universities charge. The more free money that's available for universities to take in, the more that it raises the cost for all students who don't get the scholarships. Because if the tuition can go up because it's being covered by somebody else, this actually then ends up creating barriers for people who maybe, not qualifying for the scholarships, still not able to pay for school. They end up taking out large loans. Now, what I'm saying is the scholarship bills should be directed towards loan forgiveness as opposed to paying for tuition. Same dollar amounts, but if you are aware of anything, start talking with your legislators about how this money actually can impact the workforce, as opposed to just filling some universities' endowment fund a little bit more, or being able to get 3 Subway sandwiches in student appreciation. We're just going to have an economy of Subway sandwiches. That's the way we're talking about this.
So we can try to increase the workforce by either hiring people, somehow making education cost less. There's another bill that I saw, and I think there's one in California right now, but there's a lot of them, I think, across the country that I'm sure are happening. But it's working to decrease wait times for clients, patients seeking services. And on the face of it, this is potentially bad, because then there's a legislative, potentially legal responsibility for mental health providers to take more clients more quickly. However, this is the part that I think is really interesting. And this is where I think there's a challenge for us. If insurance panels cannot keep clinicians in their roles and cannot keep up with these wait times, I'm wondering what happens. If we don't jump to this action here, am I getting into cartel territory?
No, I don't think you are, because on one
the
hand,
Cardigan cartel is taking this on.
On one hand, the history of a lot of these insurance companies is whatever fines that they end up paying are going to be probably cheaper than what they would have paid out in services anyway. And we've talked about this in things like the episodes on the Kaiser Permanente strikes in the past. But these are billion-dollar companies. Fines to them are just, shifting some numbers over from profit margins. It doesn't, these bills like this are really well intended, but they don't address workforce shortages either.
Yeah.
And potentially even gives some of these insurance companies the opportunities for having a defense of, there's no workers for us to actually hire to shorten these labor times, which then leads to what has also traditionally happened in the workforce, which is that, while this seems like a great time for mental health professionals to have a really good impact on legislation, traditionally workforce shortages have been addressed by creating or filling in with more paraprofessionals.
Yeah.
That if the really high barrier to entry positions are going to need a longer pipeline, it's being able to provide things like peer counseling services, peer support specialists. And well, those are good. It's not something that addresses the specific problems that we're facing as licensees, or for our pre-licensed listeners, on the pathway to being licensed. All the more reason for you to be involved with advocacy to address the specific issues. But my, not Pollyanna, like Debbie Downer piece of this here is, unless you really take action right now, in all of the free time and with all of that not burnt out energy that you have, history suggests that without really good action on this, we're not going to get the very needed changes that we've identified 10, 15 years ago that have all come to a head here and will likely come to a head at some other position again in the future. We need the action now to continue to call legislatures to be involved in the bill writing process, so that way it can be better. Otherwise, it's going to be filled in by paraprofessionals and continuing to just replicate the same problems that we're seeing in our workforce system.
There's a few things that you're saying that I agree with, but I also think that they don't have all the pieces to it. And so, speaking to my experience with some of these public mental health contracts and those types of things, when there is a financial shortage, so the funding goes away, because around 2008, when the Great Recession began, there was a lot of funding that went away for mental health services. And so there were really creative ways that folks added some of these positions. So there was paraprofessionals, case managers, there was different types of codes that could be used that were slightly lower rates. And there was also this huge push for evidence-based practices to, kind of create these different funding streams and kind of pull money from here and there. And what I really saw is that there was this combination of how do we make this cost less? And how do we take care of people with a lower cost and with, there wasn't a workforce shortage at that time, I don't think. I feel like there's always a little bit of a workforce shortage in public mental health, but that's a whole other conversation. But it's one of those things where there wasn't money to pay people. And so they did create these positions. But since that time, and I think this is accounted for in the RAND report as well, there's been a real efficacy seen with these multidisciplinary teams. So I don't want to say like, hey, let's get out and make sure that we get to keep all the work, because I don't know that that's necessarily what we need to do. I think we need to make sure that the work that we're doing suits our expertise and suits what is needed. But I think at that time, there was creativity that was both kind of mercenary as well as actually improving mental health care. So I don't think it's black or white, like, hey, this is just because of a workforce shortage that we need to bring in people who have different qualifications. I also think, and this is very much aligned in what you were saying, that there is a tendency to make do because it's not a nameless, faceless mental health problem. It's this client and this group and that group. And I think when we are looking to make a difference right now, I think there's looking at how do I steel my heart against wanting to solve the systemic problem myself. And that is both in how we run our practices, but it also can be in where we get employment. When an agency gets a contract, so let's say they get a $500,000 contract to provide services, if they cannot fulfill it, they lose the money. And so for public mental health providers, they actually need to stay staffed. And we can actually make a difference in who gets to keep their money by making sure we're very diligent in where we go to get employed and where we stay employed and where we do the work. And so there is, I feel like there is an element of us choosing whether or not large app companies gets our employment, whether, public mental health organizations that do shady work, whether they get our employment, we do have a value there beyond like insurance companies and their gigantic war chests being able to fight against some of these things. So maybe that was a little all over the place, but I think it's something where I don't want to say like, hey, we can only do legislation, because unless we have power in how we choose to do our work, I think there's not going to be change anyway.
You're talking about individual issues here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's also such big systemic issues that do need the focus. And while I think that there's a lot of individual efforts that we can make in our own practices, that it almost just kind of ignores the problem. I'm looking at an opinion piece in the Oregonian from September, and this was penned by Heather Jeffries, Executive Director of the Oregon Council on Behavioral Health, Cheryl Ramirez, Executive Director of the Association of Oregon Mental Health Programs, and Royce Bolin, Director of the Oregon Alliance. And their public call includes some things that very much speak to this kind of stuff: increasing funding to recruit and retrain staff, reducing administrative burden. Those things are great. Providing cash supports for organizations struggling with the financial impacts of increased costs and insufficient revenue. Fantastic. Publicly recognize and appreciate the workforce. Throw more Subway sandwiches at them, maybe misses the point.
Yeah.
But the one that stands out to me is that they are asking that the National Guard be deployed to staff residential facilities. We are in such a crisis that the heads of behavioral workforce associations are coming together and saying, we need people who have nothing as far as training to be called in by the government to come and provide staffing here. And I point all of this out because while we feel an individual responsibility to take some of these steps ourselves, there is only so much that each one of us can do that really needs to be able to address this, especially as a lot of these legislative waivers are ending and not, being progressed. Things like, telehealth supervision waivers that are, going to be gone at the end of October in California, where Katie and I practice. But in this lurch where we talked about this in our most recent episode with Ben Caldwell, is due to the legislative process, there is going to be systemic barriers that, rather than expending some of this energy more for us to help the 1 or 2 or 5 more people on our caseload that we could take on, to have a greater impact, spend those 1 or 2 or 5 hours where this can actually impact thousands of people in a much better way, even if it means looking more for long-term changes than short-term changes right now.
I want to do a yes and, because I think it is hard, and we'll do some of the legwork here. This is what we've been talking about with not focusing in on a conference this year. We will do some legwork and we will try to help have some specific guidance on how we make some impacts here on legislation, policy, that kind of stuff. But I think we also need to be very conscious about the choices we make collectively and individually on where we get hired, where we do our work, what we charge, because if there is a path to status quo, the legislative efforts won't go through.
Right.
And so we have to push back against the status quo of poor insurance reimbursements, ridiculous bureaucratic burdens on organizations. Like, we need to push back on those things individually and collectively, or it doesn't matter how many of us go. And we're a small workforce kind of in comparison to some of these gigantic, other types of professions. So all of us just saying, like, I'm going to take 2 or 3 fewer clients and going and fighting on the Hill is not going to necessarily be sufficient. I think we need to do both.
We do need to do both, but it's like the gaslighting episode where it's like, this is stuff that is predictable, that legislative changes are going to be 5-6 years from now, where it's like, we told you so. Stop complaining about stuff 5 or 6 years from now, because the call for action is right now. Legislators know that mental health needs to be addressed. What they don't know is what needs to be addressed in mental health.
Yeah.
And that's where that call to action is. And I know in some of my early online conversations, when I point these things out, the response is, well, this is at least addressing the short-term thing. That's good enough. And right now, having been involved in advocacy for as long as we have, addressing good enough for right now does not change the problems that are going to be way bigger 5 years from now.
Totally agree.
And this is really where it's giving up some of our short-term action that, still may not be kind of our perfect sort of answers to everything. I mean, we do have several more decades of podcasts that we need to make, but we do need to actually address some of our problems in our systemic part of our profession and get this stuff off the ground that we have been doing some of the legwork on. We will organize some of this stuff. We encourage you to start looking at what bills are going to be written in your respective jurisdictions. Send them to us. Send them to me, Curt at therapyreimagine.com, CURT at therapyreimagine.com. I'll give you at least, some ideas of things to start talking with your legislators about. And if your legislators aren't writing mental health stuff, be calling their offices and saying, what are you doing to address mental health stuff in our profession, in our state, in our country? Because the stuff that is being written is really
Subway sandwiches.
It's Subway sandwiches. So thank you for giving me something so we don't have a explicit on this episode.
I think we're in agreement. I think both of us just have a different take on it and what can be done more readily. You are very adept at the advocacy at the legislative level. And I think that is something where we all need to get better at it. And we need to be at some of these tables. We need to be talking to our legislators. I 100% agree. I think if we are working for places who are exploiting us at the same time, we are undermining our efforts. So that's all I'm saying.
Okay, I agree with that.
Overall, kind of summarizing the call to action is really assess where you are in this time, in this really pivotal time for our profession. Are you working in a way that supports you and the work that you want to do? Have you created bandwidth so at the same time you can advocate and make changes at the larger scale so that you're both supporting yourself, standing by your principles and how you are going to work, and pushing for larger systemic change?
Be in touch with us. Follow our social media. Take those Subway sandwiches and tell your supervisors where to put them. And until next time, I'm Curt Widhalm with Katie Vernoy.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Turning Point.
We wanted to tell you a little bit more about our sponsor, Turning Point. Turning Point is a financial planning firm that's focused exclusively on serving mental health professionals. They'll help you navigate all the important elements of your personal finances, like budgeting, investing, selecting retirement plans, managing student loan debt, and evaluating big purchases, like your first home. And because they specialize in serving therapists in private practice, they'll help you navigate the finances of your practice as well. They'll help you navigate bookkeeping, analyze the financial implications of changes like hiring clinicians or diversifying your income sources. They'll even help you consider strategies like S-Corp tax election.
And for listeners of MTSG, you'll receive 30% off the price of their Quick Start Coaching Intensive. Just enter promo code Modern Therapist when signing up. And don't forget to visit turningpointhq.com to download your free finance quick start guide for therapists.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. Learn more about who we are and what we do at mtsgpodcast.com. You can also join us on Facebook and Twitter. And please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes.